The Tim Heale Podcasts. Ordinary people's extraordinary stories.
Welcome to the Tim Heale Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to have a chat with Neil. Neil's going to tell us where and when he was born. He's going to describe what it was like where he grew up, the schools he went to, and the education that he received. So, Neil, it's over to you, mate.
Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here. Where I grew up in a little place. So I'm born in May 1960, and grew up in a little place called Boundary Bay. It's south of Vancouver, British Columbia. It's on a peninsula and right on the border with the U.S. You're like 2 blocks from the U.S. and 2 blocks from the beach. And that part of the U.S. is called Point Roberts, and it's just a little chunk of land that's disconnected from the rest of the mainland USA. My dad was a machinist, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She had a home economics degree in university, and I was the youngest of 6 kids. So I had 4 older sisters and 1 older brother. It was a beach community, really, a summer community, and maybe 50% of the residents were permanent, and the other 50% just kind of came in during the summer. And, back in the 60s, we had friends over in the U.S. and, we used to play baseball and stuff together. As kids, we just ride our bikes across and, wave at the border guard as we're doing it. Things have changed, obviously, since then.
So you didn't need a passport back then?
No. Well, especially to Point Roberts. You got to Point Roberts, there was nowhere to go unless you had a boat. So, we used to go over. They had some great stores over there. And back then the difference in the buck was 5 cents. So, as a Canadian buck was ahead 5 cents or US buck was ahead 5 cents. One of the two. It flipped back and forth. So,
difference then.
Yeah, exactly. And, so it was good. It was, my dad died when I was 5. And my mom had to go out and, get a job right away. So, my grandmother lived 2 doors up the street. She looked after me while, all my siblings went to school. School kind of ran from September to June. And, he died July 4th, 1965. So my mom went to get a teaching certificate. And that summer, she took 3 years of summer school for that. But luckily, back then she could, with her undergrad degree, she could get a job teaching. So she went into teaching, and, my grandmother looked after me, and she used to be a former teacher herself. So I actually learned how to read and write. I could actually print and write before I went to grade 1. And so I was lucky that way. Played baseball and, softball and basketball and hockey and football as I grew up. But my mom remarried when I was 13, and I moved to the person she married, owned a 500 head of Hereford cattle ranch in northern BC, about halfway up BC. BC is a very long province, like north to south. So it was exactly 500 miles from our doorstep to his, and it was in the middle of nowhere. There were 4 ranches. It was 130 miles from the nearest kind of civilized town, and was 100 miles of gravel road and then 30 miles of dirt road to get to the ranch. Went from kind of
difficult then.
Well, it was quite a transition. I was the only one in the family that moved. I was 13, and the next sister closest to me was 16, and she was going into grade 11, I think, if I calculate correctly. So she stayed with my grandmother. My older brother had just, he graduated high school, and he stayed, and all the other rest of the family had dispersed and left the family home. Not necessarily of their own volition, but they did. And anyway, I moved to this remote community where, I had 130 head of horses, 500 head of cattle, There's 2,700 acres around the house, another 2,700 acres about 4 miles away down at a lake. And those were all hay meadows and natural hay meadows. And then there was a range that was about 20 miles from the bottom end of the range was 20 miles from the house. And it was 20 miles by 40 miles long is where the cattle were from, spring to fall. And so I learned how to ride a horse and break horses and rope cattle and brand cattle and, all the things you do on a ranch. And there was no indoor, there was some indoor plumbing, but the only thing that we used it for was to, kind of bathe or wash dishes. Water was well water. You had to get it in a bucket. And we had a single cylinder Lister motor that ran every now and then for some electricity, and it was very wasn't nice and smooth, so you could see the light bulbs pulsing. and it wasn't, and toilet facilities were an outhouse, and so the temperatures ranged in the summer from 80 degrees Fahrenheit to maybe in a hot day, it might be 90s. But in the winter, it's typically 20 to 40 below. And one winter, it went down to 60 below for 3 days. So, it was very cold. I did high school, so grade 8, 9, 10, and half of grade 11 by correspondence on my own. And and I would go out.
That?
Pardon me?
How did you find that?
At the time, I was, I did schoolwork from 9 in the morning to noon, and I started in October and I finished in March. A regular school year was typically beginning of September to end of June, and if I was going to school, you would have showed up at 8:30 in the morning and been finished at 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon. And so, I did my studies. I didn't have any problems with them. I did well with them. I felt at the time I was, if I had been taken me and put me in a school, that I would have not been as well educated or learned the same things that people were learning in a school. But that ended up not being the case. What I was missing, of course, was the social interaction and the social development that happens in that time frame. So I became very insular. Self-sufficient. I would do my schoolwork from 9 to noon every day, and then I would jump on my horse. If the weather was fine, if it wasn't really much past 20 below, or, whatever time in the summer, anything warmer than 20 below, I'd be on my horse and I'd be just riding off into the into the woods wherever I wanted to go. I'd fish and hunt all year round, even though hunting wasn't open all year round. Yeah. But we're out in the middle of nowhere, and it was good. And then
did your mum help you studying? Because she's a qualified teacher. Did she?
So she taught. She taught
and all the rest of it.
No, she didn't help me at all. She was a bit of a disciplinarian back then, and she secured the position of the principal and teacher at a one-room school, and taught all of the local kids from kind of grade 1 through grade 7 before they had to leave to go somewhere else. So most of those were First Nations, and then there was a few kind of white folks, so to speak. And that's how she spent her days, and she secured me a job to be the janitor of that school. And so consequently, I don't know, I think it was $400 a month gross back in 73. And so when I turned 16, I had saved my money. I'd bought a kind of a new saddle and some new rifles and stuff. But when I turned 16, I could get my driver's license, and I ordered a brand new 4x4 GMC pickup, 3/4 ton pickup. That got delivered, and I had the money to pay for that. But
did it have a big V8 engine in it, or was it a
yeah,
small
no
engine?
V8. No V8.
Yeah.
It was a 350 V8. Yep.
Bit of a gas
Yep.
guzzler. I had one of those.
It
in
was,
Iraq, funny enough.
but back then, gas was like, I remember I had 2 tanks, and I could fill it for less than $20, both tanks for less than $20.
Outrageous.
Yeah. Anyway, so in grade 11, I finished half of grade 11 by correspondence, but I couldn't do the math. I needed some assistance with the math, and my mom couldn't help me. So my mom had kept the family home, and I moved back and lived by myself in this 5-bedroom home, and got back into and went to high school. Well, the high school I would have gone to had we stayed in that community. So that was in Tawasin. And so then I finished half grade 11 and grade 12, living by myself. And then, kind of bummed around, really. I got into some things teenagers get into in that age, which, ends up being an experience for me. And I didn't carry on those kinds of things as I got into my 20s. But
so how did you find going to high school after being all that time by yourself? Did you manage to integrate? How was your level of education compared with the other kids in the class?
It was totally fine. So that's where I said it ended up not being an issue. The thing I was missing was the social interaction. So the high school was a conglomeration, of course. There was a number of elementary schools that fed the high school. So our high school class was 400 students. And because I had gone to elementary school, finished grade 7 in the area, I knew a portion of those people from my childhood. Yeah. So those kinds of and some of them remained friends with me, and others, they had moved on, and they had other friends and stuff like that. But we were still cordial and kind of pleasant to each other, of course, because we were longtime friends. But I was an outsider. I showed up in this pretty metropolitan school that, back then there were Mustangs and Barracudas and, some pretty nice cars, hot rods and, some cars from the 50s. And, here I show up wearing cowboy boots and a big cowboy belt buckle and, snap shirts and a cowboy hat. I was a bit of an outsider. So it was a little bit strange. I wasn't really accepted by a lot of the people. So consequently, the only group that I was really accepted with were the, kind of, maybe you'd call them the outliers or whatever, more of the, kids that were not part of the, kind of all the different cliques in school, So
there were other kids that came in from sort of the outlying areas. Did they board or did they have to travel in every day?
Into my high school or into...
Yeah.
No, the high school was a metropolitan, when I went to high school, that was back in the community I had first started.
Yeah.
So it was, there was no boarding or anything. It was, it was a very vibrant, little community south of Vancouver, British Columbia. So, so it was, they were all local kids. So it was, a fairly large community. I couldn't, if I had to guess at a population back then, maybe, 15, 20,000 people. So it wasn't...
It was a sort of medium-sized place then.
Yeah. Back then it was, big high school, junior high from grade 8 to grade 10, grade 9, and then the high school from grade 10 to grade 12. Yeah. So, and a number of feeders. So it was, kind of metropolitan. Anyway, then I kind of bummed around and worked in a pizza joint, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, and my mom was getting kind of fed up with that and wanted me to do something. So I got my Class 1 driver's license in air, which allowed me to drive tractor trailers, and I drove truck for a while, and then I got married when I was 20, and then decided I'd go to university. So I didn't have any counseling about university. I didn't have any direction from any parents or anything on university. I just decided I wanted to be an engineer. So I went to school and applied for engineering. And I had to take a couple makeup courses because it was a couple of years I'd been finished high school, and took chemistry and physics and, kind of refresher in math. And then I applied for the engineering school and got in. So it was a 1 year science and 4 years of engineering at the time. So graduated in '86, and there was a economic crash in the area in Canada at that time, and there were no jobs, and engineers were being laid off. So it took me probably a year before I found my first job, and that was in Toronto. So moved to Toronto for a few years and worked as a professional engineer.
So just take you back slightly. So you got your Class 1 driving license. What sort of driving were you doing? Were you doing sort of long distance haul, long haul, or just local driving
Well, that's
around?
so I wanted to do long haul, but it was tough to get into. And the easiest way was to buy your own rig, and it was $100,000 at the time. So I didn't do that. I drove a little bit of local around town. And then I got a job driving concrete mixer. So that required a Class 3, but I had my Class 1. And with a Class 1 in Canada, you can drive anything except motorcycle. You need a separate license for a motorcycle. So, which I have. Anyway, so I delivered concrete for, I don't know, a couple of years. And I did that. But that got, I got kind of... great job, necessary job, of course, good for the community and society. Of course, it's a necessary thing. But for me, it was, putting up with the traffic and, kind of running the same routes and every day and stuff like that. It wasn't anything that was going to kind of satisfy me long term. So I decided I'd go to engineering.
So it took you a year to get a job after you left university and you moved to Toronto. So what sort of engineering were you doing?
So I got a degree. So I got a degree in bioresource engineering, which was a mixture of mechanical, civil, and agricultural engineering. And what I ended up doing initially was environmental work, environmental studies, and assessments. And I did some small hydroelectric. Design, reservoir stuff, water. I had a kind of a focus on water flow, pipes and open flow, that kind of stuff. And so I worked a couple years doing that, and then I got a job with, at the time, Ontario Hydro, which was downtown Toronto. And I worked with them in, they called it river control. So that dealt with extreme events, either floods or drought. And then I was looking to get back to Vancouver area. So I kept looking for jobs. And finally I got a job with a consulting firm in Vancouver, and we moved back to Vancouver. My wife and I had 2 children at the time, a girl and a boy. And so I worked for a consulting firm, but they shopped me out to BC Hydro, which is the, kind of state-owned, if you will, or province-owned a hydroelectric utility for all of British Columbia. And they're predominantly water power. And so I did some work via the consulting firm for them for a year, and then I started to look for jobs within BC Hydro, and managed to make a move after about a year and a bit to work at the control center for BC Hydro. And the control center is where you kind of plan out long-term use of water and reservoirs to meet the need over the year and long-term for the kind of load. And so started to work.
Is that kind of looking at a dam and working out how much water you need to keep in the dam to be able to keep the the turbines going to produce the electric all the time that you needed it? Or
Yeah,
was it...
yeah, that's exactly right. And now BC Hydro is blessed with some, it's got 3 major facilities, some of the largest in the world, not the largest necessarily, but some of the largest. So for Williston, for instance, has 100 feet of drawdown and 32 million acre feet of storage. That's a big storage. That's a 4 to 5 year storage facility. Micah has, if I remember correctly, about 150 feet of drawdown and a smaller reservoir. So it's got like maybe 14 million acre feet. These are big storage facilities. So it has the ability to store, so all your smaller plants that you either run or spill water at, you never want to spill. So what you do is you run those plants hard when, when the springs, when you get spring melt and stuff, and then you just back off on the large plants to fill up reservoirs. So, it's that kind of balancing. So back then, Hydro had 33 hydroelectric facilities. So the planning was, how do you best balance water use for, meeting the needs through the various months, but also plan for the long term.
Sounds like a really interesting job. I
Yeah,
guess
it was
that's
very
where your
interesting.
maths comes in, does it?
Pardon me?
That's where your maths comes in.
Yeah, exactly.
Working out all those big numbers. Now, during the winter time, do the reservoirs sort of freeze over? And does that affect the amount of flow that you can have? Or doesn't it make much impact at all?
So what you do is you change your operations to fix that. So for instance, I'll give you so in the Lower Mainland, they wouldn't necessarily freeze over, but elsewhere in BC, they freeze. And so you have 2 issues in where it gets really cold. You have issues of the river freezing over at too low a level, so you lose capacity on water discharge. And so, and then balance that with how much water you have in the reservoir. So for the large facilities like GMS, which is Williston, the reservoir name is different than the generating plant is different than the dam. So GMS generating plant, Williston Reservoir, and anyway, and I can't remember what they call the dam, GM Shrum, I think. Anyway, so what you do is you're projecting all the time we had weather forecasting as well. And so you're projecting all the time what those cold fronts look like and stuff. And then when it's going to get to the place where you're going to start to freeze the river over, what you do is you try and run the plant at the highest water capacity you can, so that when it freezes over and you get this really solid ice, then you can restrict the outflow. And what happens is that the water level will drop below the ice level, but the ice has this nice frozen cap at a high level. Mm-hmm. So then that lets you be able to swing the plant to have a higher discharge or a lower discharge throughout the year. So you have to. So there's ways to plan for those kinds of things, and that's what these professionals do. So.
And do you have anything to do with once you've produced the electric? Do you have that side of it where you're planning on when peak power times, peak requirement power times are, or is it you're just managing the water side of it?
No. In order to plan your load, you use historical records of how electricity is used in each of the load centers and throughout the province on a 24-hour basis for the year. So you're using historical data over a long term to project with the predicted weather forecasts what those load requirements are going to be. So that's it's there's a lot of factors that go into the planning of this stuff. So these are the kinds of this is what people get paid for. So,
yeah.
to balance all of these things.
Yeah, quite a technical job. Yeah, I mean, and I suppose you'll get peak times where you get something like a football game, where you get peaks and troughs where people are sort of jumping up sort of half time to go and put the kettle on. So
Same kind of thing,
that's looking at that side of it. So you're sort of working out the timings that you're going to get a big drain that you just need to crank up slightly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a challenging old job, I must admit.
No, it was good. It was a good job, and it was sophisticated work, so to speak. But we had, there was lots of tools and lots of experience, and you learn from the people that had been doing it for a while, and you gain those skill sets, and you go through it. And I mean, that's why engineers take, all the maths that they do and all the science that they do is so that they can do these kinds of things, right? So.
Brilliant. So how long were you at that job for?
So I worked as an employee of BC Hydro from 1990 to 2002. That particular work for about 5 years, and then then there was a large reorganization. So BC Hydro at the time probably had 3,500 employees. They did a large reorganization. They moved things around as these big corporations do. And I was moved over into human resources. And I was in, so I had a team of 12 people that I was looking after. And these are all human resource professionalists that knew, everything about HR. And I knew very little. But I was, they wanted to try out the kind of model that engineering uses to, kind of shuffle people around from project to project. And so I did that for about 1.5 years, and it was a good learning experience. But certainly I'm not an HR professional. So then I moved into, kind of more project management work. I did a little bit of work with marketing, and did some assessment for all the things on the hydroelectric reservoirs. For instance, whenever you use those facilities, you affect the environment, and you affect people's use, and you affect industry's use. And so downstream, of course, fisheries is always concerned about not having enough water or too much water. Not necessarily too much water being an issue unless you're flooding lands and other things downstream. So that, water flow in the river affects recreational use. Water drawdowns in the reservoir affect industry typically, and also can affect recreational use. So we went through this process of trying to sort through, were there better ways that we could balance the needs of the many and still maintain the economic advantage that we needed to maintain in order to, keep this system running and keep it running in an efficient way. And so I was on a special team for 1 year, and we did this process. We developed we did a lot of analysis and going out and talking to a lot of various peoples and communities throughout the province. And we came up with a 1,300 page report that we delivered with some recommendations to government. And then government and BC Hydro, they worked together for a couple years to sort through how would they actually implement those recommendations. So then I moved over to a team that was doing this negotiation with government about what would be implemented and how we'd go about implementing it. And then that implementation process, has been carried on for probably 15 years, and maybe some of it is still going on today. I don't know. I didn't keep track of it. But after I did that work, then I moved into project management, and project management on the generation side of things. So that's anything to do with generating stations, reservoirs, rivers, those kinds of things. So projects like that. So, small projects, $300,000 to $100 million.
Oh, just peanuts in the grander scheme of things.
Yeah, well, some of these projects these days are $1 billion projects, right? Or $14 billion projects. So yeah. But, it was good. It was good work. And, I enjoyed working with the people. One thing that BC Hydro has, as with all of these large companies, they have some very bright people. Their processes and stuff may be onerous at times, and maybe you don't agree with the politics because they're a politically driven company that are influenced by the owner, and the owner is the province. But if you can put that stuff aside, the people that work there typically are very bright, very capable, and fun to work with. They're good people.
Well, I've been involved in one hydro plant, I suppose it would have been, that was in up in Kajaki, and they were moving the new generator up there, and I had some involvement in the planning side of it, and the psychological operation to do with moving this generator from when it came into the country from Bastion up to Kajaki, which is a massive operation to get it up there, because they had to take it up by road. They couldn't fly it up there, and we were working on the project of trying to dissuade the Taliban from attacking the convoy, and getting the locals involved, and one thing and another. So yeah, it was quite the operation.
Yeah, I
we managed to get out there without incident, but I'm not sure whether it actually ever got installed and got to working.
Wow.
By then.
Well, it's and that's a really special challenge, of course, because of the environment that you're in. But even moving really large equipment like that in a society where we don't have those issues, in Afghanistan, where people are at war. But, even doing that, it can be a very difficult thing because typically, a lot of this equipment is much larger than any road. So you have to plan with the Ministry of Transportation to how you're going to move it at night, and, what you need to go around, what roads or highways need to be closed to move it. And,
yeah,
you got to take into account how wide are bridges, and can you get it across, and is the load too heavy for a bridge or too tall? It's complicated stuff, right? When you're trying to move stuff like that around. So
I guess that your days as a lorry driver maybe helped in some of those schemes.
Well, it never hurts, right? Never having, always having those kinds of experiential things always help with your planning, because you think about those things. You might not have the solution, but at least you're twigged to, oh, that could be an issue, right? And then you can find somebody that can actually resolve that issue or solve that issue, right? So, yeah, no, that's all very handy. And then I left BC Hydro voluntarily in 2002. I had enough of the politics, and so I left, and I joined a friend of mine, and we started a little startup company for GPS tracking. And we didn't get any capital financing, which, is kind of the death of any small company like that. But we did our best. We built a very good product. We had some customers, but, you need cash infusions to make that work. So we ended up wrapping that up after 3 years, and I went into consulting, doing what I was doing, but doing it on a consulting basis. Project management
so you left
stuff.
voluntarily. Was there redundancy involved with that, or it was you just sort of had enough and pulled the pin and put your resignation in?
Yeah, it was the latter. I'd had enough. The politics were, for my mindset, too hot. It was, hey, we're headed north, and everybody gets on the board on the track heading north, and then 6 months later, oh no, we're going east. It's just like And
Yeah.
and in my opinion, there were, kind of not reasoned and thought out and logical things. They were just all politically motivated. So that didn't really work for me.
And it
So
depends on when the elections were coming and
all those kinds of factors. Yeah,
all
absolutely. And
that.
whoever the new government was, and, like, there's a lot of factors there. And, so that wasn't working for me. So I voluntarily left.
So the GPS business, what did that involve?
So that involved, finding a technology. So this is back in 2002. So, this is just when this stuff is emerging. And, we got a technology out of Singapore, I think it was, Taiwan or Singapore. And, it was fairly pricey technology, and it was really around building the software interface that would, get that information remotely via cell phone technology, and then be able to display that for the user. And so that was all new stuff at the time. And, we had some clients that benefited a lot from that. One of them was a former that I used to drive concrete truck for. So, they had a number of trucks. And by them actually getting that information, they could automatically make a queue of who came into the yard last. So they get a queue of what driver they're going to load up. They're more efficient because they could figure out, where trucks were at any time and when they would likely be getting back. And, so it helped them with their planning. So boosted their productivity significantly. So they were, very happy with that product. But like I said, we were undercapitalized, and others made it out ahead of us. So
Yeah. So that was early versions of satellite tracking then on trucks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And
It
now
was
it's real commonplace.
Yeah, now it's all commonplace, right? So yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we had initially we thought, well, we get it for commercial vehicles, but we could sell it to personal people, like consumers, to put in their cars. And we, set it up so that if your car got towed, you could be notified immediately. You could track your car wherever it was. You could remotely lock or unlock it. There was a number of things that is quite commonplace today. But that's the kind of stuff that we were doing.
So unfortunately that came to a head, and you wound it up. And then you say you went off consulting, doing what you were doing before. So
Yeah.
who were you doing it for?
Well, a variety of clients, but mostly I went back to doing work for my former employer. They had they have a $1 billion project. Now it's probably almost $2 billion or $2.5 billion on an annual basis, and they needed experienced people. I mean, so when you're doing project management in a large organization like that has a lot of different, so engineering split up into various disciplines. So, for instance, there's a lot of moving parts with making any of a hydroelectric facility or an electric facility work. So it's all got to work. You generate, and so that's a whole thing. And then you have transmission lines, and you have transmission substations, and then you get to a substation that you need to. It's called a distribution substation, of which then you have local feeders that go out and feed, commercial businesses or housing. So all of those different things require all kinds of different experience in doing all that, from telecommunications through equipment, through design and lines and all that kind of stuff. So it's complicated, and there's lots of people involved. And so someone, in order to make all of that kind of get pulled together, you need a conductor that's experienced in that and can make the symphony work, because all the different players, and who needs to interact with who at what time, and what each of the deliverables are from each team in order to get yourself to an end product. So the fact that I had a lot of experience, and and quite frankly I was good at it and still am good at it, I was very quickly brought back on to work as a consultant and look after teams. So, and they could be internal teams or they could be external teams.
As a separate entity. So I guess you was on twice the money that you was on before. But paid as a consultant.
Yeah, because, when you own your own business, you have your own costs, right? You got your own accounting, your own legal, your own bookkeeping, all that kind of stuff that goes associated with owning a business. So you get all the, you get compensated for all the overhead, and, you have to have your own insurance, and, there's a lot that goes on when you own your own business. So, that costs money too. So, so you get paid on an hourly rate. You get paid much more than as an employee, but you don't have any of the benefits. You don't get... you don't get medical leave, you don't get long-term disability, you don't get dental, you don't get medical, you get none of that stuff, right? So,
yeah. So where does that bring you to now? Did that bring you up to date, more or less?
Yeah, there's a little story there. So it kind of brings me up to date, but like I said, there's a little bit of a story with that. So what happened from 2002, when I went into consulting, life becomes about pleasing clients. So you don't get repeat work if you don't do good work, and you don't, meet your clients' needs, and they're not happy with your work. So the focus becomes about work. And you don't get paid when you take time off. You don't get paid for stats. You don't get paid when you're sick or you take holidays. So essentially what you do is you work. At least that's what I did. And now my first wife and I, we split up in 1993 after 13 years of marriage. And I was remarried in 1998 to the love of my life. And we had combined families then. She had an older son, and I had two kids. I had a girl and a boy. And so in 2002, I'm off doing consulting work. She's got her own consulting stuff that she's doing. And so the both of us just kind of work, launched the kids. They left, my daughter got married. The older son went and lived on, by himself. And my youngest son went to, finished high school and then went to McGill University in Montreal. And from 2002 to 2015, I essentially kind of drove myself into this really deep and despondent depression. I was, kind of working hard. We would have great vacations. My wife was originally from Germany, so we'd go back and visit relatives, and we'd have fun and, all that kind of stuff. But day-to-day life, I was miserable. And we're all good actors in our environment. And, you can put forward whatever you want to clients, family, and friends, even though inside you might be an entire mess. And so that's the situation I was in. I put forth, congenial, affable, humor, all those kind of good things. But inside I was a mess. So in 2015, still doing consulting work, in 2015, I realized that I was in this deep despondent depression. And without getting into some of the details that maybe we will discuss, by the time 2017, I was trying to get out of that by reading some books and stuff. And in 2017, November 2017, so my wife and I had built this really lovely waterfront home about 4 hours from Vancouver. It was a ferry ride and then a 2-hour drive. And it was in this remote place, and it was so beautiful. But it was very expensive, and it cost a lot of money. And in 2008, when the markets crashed, it never recovered. That area never recovered. And so we had it listed for 7 years before it finally sold. Or 5 years anyway. So in 2017, November 2017, it sold. My wife got on a plane to go to Toronto to visit family and friends in Toronto. And I sat down at a kitchen table in this little 1-bedroom rental apartment we had in the city and crafted a suicide note. And I was still doing consulting at the time. My clients didn't know. No one knew I was in this state. Anyway, I crafted this suicide note, but some information had come to me about a week later that promised to liberate me from my thinking. And so I followed that. I pushed my suicide out. I was planning it, being an engineer. So I'm planning it and I'm thinking, okay, about 3 months from now, I'll pull the trigger and say goodbye to family and friends without them knowing what I was going to do, and make sure I wasn't going to leave any burdens for my wife. She'd be financially okay, get rid of all the crap that I accumulated over my life that, we never use. And then this material had come to me about a week prior that promised to liberate me from my thinking. So I thought, okay, well, I'll push out the date on committing the suicide and I'll study this material. If it works, great. And if it doesn't, then I can always pull the trigger. And a year later, I woke up and I was full of inner peace and love and joy. And I had this new verve for life, this new outlook on life. I felt totally abundant and prosperous. It was just like totally changed and transformed how I viewed the world. And I went into 2 meditations. This would be December 2018, late December 2018, where I went into this meditation. And when you go through this process I went through, you raise your frequency of vibration. And I got into this state where I was just enveloped in unconditional love. Didn't matter what I'd done in the past. I felt I was not judged for anything I did. It was just amazing. I just wanted to stay there forever. And I had 2 of these meditations 2 days apart. And my whole life has changed in terms of this. And so it took me a couple of years to figure out the best way to share. I wanted to share this information. I thought, well, if I do this from the rooftops, which I wanted to do, I'd be looked at like an idiot. So I thought, okay, it took me a couple of years to figure out the best way to do that is to write a book. So I've written a book. I was still doing consulting. And then in end of May 2019, onset of COVID, I finished a project, the last project I was working on for my client, finished that project, and then work dried up after that. With COVID, they had to cut back on all their work, and they had enough employees to do the work that they were doing. So, kind of all my consulting work dried up at that point, as with a bunch of other people. And so I wrote a book, and I'm published that book in September 2021, so last September. And I've been on a mission to share this knowledge with people. It's the same process I went through, and the material I used to make that happen that has just totally transformed my life. Like my depression totally gone, and I just have this new outlook in life and this new verve about life, and I don't get caught up in anything anymore. I mean, all the horrible things going on in the world right now that we do to each other, but I'm just not caught up in it. And so that brings us up to date in terms of where I'm at now. It's just like, I just totally transformed.
So how is the book doing?
The book's doing very well. It's, I share new knowledge. I share new information with people that has really never been discussed or is certainly not topical. And I would call it not very well known, this information. And, it's a 7-step process that I went through, and I share that with people, in the hopes that, I'll make a difference in some people's lives. And, my goal is to, help change people's consciousness, and it has to be done one person at a time. Life is an internal journey. It's not an external event. And, you got to do this inner work to make this happen. But, when you have the tools and you actually understand the mechanics of the universe and how we use it every moment of every day to bring every event and every experience into our life, when you understand those things, you can make a conscious choice of, I'd like to change that and go through this process, or no, I want to carry on, keep living the way I'm living. and that's fine too. But the more people that we get to shift their consciousness, they will view life differently and will help bring this world into a new state of new era of love and peace. And that's my goal, is to help create this new era of love and peace throughout the world.
Oh, right. Where can people get your book? And is it done as an Audible book as well?
So I'll answer that question first. Audible book's not done yet. There will be one coming, but I don't have a date for that. But the book itself is available in bookstores, or, Amazon's a typical one where people can get it. It's called A Higher Road: Cleanse Your Consciousness to Transcend the Ego and Ascend Spiritually. A 7-step process to inner peace, joy, love, abundance, and prosperity. And it's by D. Neil Elliott. And it's available in print. It's available in hardcover or paperback or ebook, and in all the favorite ebook forms: Kindle, Apple, Nook, Kobo. So yeah, you can get it. Like I say, you can get it globally. You can find out more on my website, which I see is scrolling along the bottom here, but that is dneilelliott.com. And for listeners that may be not watching the video of this, a real easy way to get to that same website is ahigherroad.com. And that'll just take you to my author website as well, so you can learn more about it.
Fantastic. So it's gonna come out in Audible version sooner or later. Who's reading it? Are you reading it yourself, or do you have a professional thespian that's going to do it?
No, I'm going to read it. So I did some acting when I was in my 40s, and I did a couple of voice things. Now, I'm not a professional at it, but I've always wanted to kind of do that, and so I'd like to actually create that myself.
So what are you going to do? You're going to hire a studio to go and do it, and have a professional do it in a professional studio, or are you going to do it at home?
I'm going to do it at home. So part of this thing that I'm doing right now is making sure I got the microphone set up properly. I've spent $1,000 Canadian on doing acoustic treatment in this room so it doesn't echo. And but I will have a professional audio engineer do the fixing up of all of the of the audio track to make sure that it's makes it as clean as possible.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
Well,
so
Neil,
that's my next little project on that.
So sounds as though it's going to be something to work towards. Sounds really good.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tim. Appreciate being here today and having a conversation with you, and it's a pleasure to meet you and do this, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
The Tim Heale Podcasts. Ordinary people's extraordinary stories.